Good evening. I'd like to call this Town Council Committee of the Whole meeting to order. This is a special meeting. It is a joint meeting with the City Council. All town councilors are present.
And all city councilors are present with the exception of Deputy Mayor Garish, who is on vacation.
Thank you. And what I wanted to do to start was just explain the purpose of our meeting, and then I would like to just have everybody introduce themselves, please, that's sitting around the table. The only thing I would ask is that because we're not at the podium or at the dais here, you'll need to make sure you're speaking into the microphone. So just pass it off or pass the whole thing off, whatever you prefer. So this tonight is the first quarterly meeting of the new Town Council. And we have decided that we will be meeting on a quarterly basis, Town Council, City Council, just to keep apprised of what the two councils are doing and to try to foster better relations between the two entities. So that is what we're doing here tonight. And the agenda is fairly simple, just to get us caught up to date on areas where we would like to move forward together. So I am Patrice Granatowski, I'm the town mayor. This is...
I am Keith Hedrick, I am the city mayor.
And would you like to just go around, please?
Rich Moravcik, Town Councilor.
Rachel Franco, Town Council.
Rita Schmidt, Town Council.
Juliet Parker, Town Council.
Rashad Carter, City Council.
Jill Rusk, City Council.
Guinevere Depot, City Council.
Stephen Sheffield, Groton City Council.
Jamal Beckford, Groton City Council.
Joe Zapiri, Town Council.
Conrad Heed, Town Council.
David Atwater, Town Council.
It's like the RTM. Leanne Aubrey, Town Council.
Thank you all for coming out. And we will be on to item number 3, which is new business, 2018-0006, joint meeting with City of Groton. And this is a 2018 standing referral. We have 3 items that we'll be discussing tonight: road funding, tax increment financing, and disposition of empty schools. So I'm going to throw it over to the town manager to introduce town staff. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I know there were some questions related to bonding and how the process works, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to have kind of an education session. So joining us tonight is Judith Blank from Dave Pitney. She's our bond counsel. And I have Bill Lindsay from IBIC, who is our financial advisor. And they're both going to give a short overview of bonds and how it works in the town of Groton, and then we'll open it up to some questions.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm with Dave Pitney, I'm Judith Blank, and...
Microphone, please. Thank you. We need it to be picked up for the audience.
I'm Judith Blank with Dave Pitney, as Cindy said, and we are the town's bond counsel. And the role of bond counsel, for most people don't know this, and Bill will wake you up when I'm done. So back in the 19th century, as the nation was expanding west, municipalities argued over who would get the railroad because that would enable them to thrive. And so what they did is borrowed money to help finance the railroad expansion west. And then if they either the railroad didn't come or for some reason they failed, they said, oops, we don't really have the authority to do this and we don't owe you the money. So the market developed for a bond counsel opinion independent of the town attorney that said, yes, these bonds are properly authorized and they're valid and binding. And when you go to market, you pledge your taxing power, and we, in essence, bless the bonds. That's what we do. The other thing we do is during the 20th century, the United States Congress said, we don't like the tax exemption that's afforded to bonds. We find it to be a very inefficient subsidy. So they restricted all manner of tax-exempt issuance in terms of what can be financed on a tax-exempt basis, for how long, when, and in what manner. And so the other thing we do is guide you in issuing tax-exempt debt and the rules regarding that. And the third thing is the thrust that developed essentially in this century is to have disclosure of municipal debt almost mirror disclosure of corporate debt. So that all, if you've heard of Edgar, all the financing things and reports that public companies have to do the SEC would like municipalities to do. They have not yet been successful in that, but there are a number of requirements that apply to municipalities issuing debt in the public markets, and we advise you on that. So briefly, I have here, for anybody who would like, some basics on municipal bonding and the process that the town of Groton has to follow for authorizing its debt.
Thank you. Are there enough for everyone?
I'm
If not, we
sure.
can make copies at some point, but we will need one to enter into the record, please. Thank you.
All right. Cindy? So my name is Bill Lindsay. I represent a firm of independent bond investment consultants. We are the town's debt advisor. So, yeah, if you push on. And so our role in financing is we help the town gain access to the capital markets. We help the town put together the offering prospectus that they'll use to give to investors when they're coming to market. We'll assist the town with the credit rating process and basically help them, facilitate the financing of the debt. So what I did is I put together just a brief, hopefully brief presentation with kind of an overview of municipal bonds and the municipal bond market. And I thought we'd go through that, and then at the end, I have some specifics related to the town and the town's current debt position and your local debt policy.
Would this be the same in the city?
Not necessarily. We're listening to this because the town is the one that would carry the road bond, correct?
Okay, thanks, Red. All right, so if you all have copies, just the first thing beginning on page 2 is kind of discuss the idea of the different funding sources for capital projects. So first and foremost, the easiest and cheapest way to finance capital projects obviously would be to pay cash, what we refer to as pay-as-you-go financing. So that can be done through a variety of ways. The simplest is to put money in your operating budget, so direct cash to capital to pay for the asset and the improvement. The second way, which the town is certainly familiar with because this is part of your local funding policy, is to establish a reserve account, which you fund over time in increments and then use that to make your larger capital purchases or capital improvements. It's the cheapest way, obviously, because we're not borrowing the money and having to repay it back with interest. The second way that we can finance capital improvements would be to get a grant from a higher level of government, so state or federal grants. Again, you're familiar with this. Make an application, receive the money, and then finance the asset. But when those two options aren't available to you, then the third option would be to go out to the capital markets and borrow for the projects. I listed two different methods of borrowing here. One simply is to go directly to the investor in the form of a direct placement, where we would place the loan directly with the investor. But more commonly, we're issuing debt obligations or bonds to finance our capital improvements. Right? We'll talk about that next. So the fundamental question is, why would we be issuing debt, right? And so we've given you the main justifications for doing that. Simply, if we do not have enough current resources to finance a long-term capital asset, then we typically would go to the market and borrow for it. We refer to this as intergenerational equity. Why should, the thought process being, why should taxpayers of today have to be the ones who carry the burden of funding the capital project that would be in use for 10, 20, 30 years, okay? So we're spreading out that amongst the generations. The second reason why we would issue debt is if the cost of the improvements exceed what our available resources are. So again, we've got a large capital project, say schools, for example, which you're familiar with. We don't have the available resources now to pay cash for those. We need to go out to the market and borrow for them. Moving to page 4, talk a little about some characteristics of municipal bonds. So as Judith alluded to earlier, most municipal bonds, when I say municipal bonds, the market is generally a state and local government bond market. Those are generally issued on a tax-exempt basis. And as a result, investors are willing to pay a little more in a dollar price to obtain that tax exemption. Generally speaking, municipal bonds are sold at a higher dollar price and lower yields as a result of the benefit of that tax exemption to the investor. Because additionally, there is a perception of safety when it comes to municipal bonds. Municipal bonds have a very low default rate, so investors were willing to pay more in a dollar price to obtain the bonds because it's perceived to be a safe investment. So some additional characteristics of the municipal market, just to kind of give you an idea of what the depth and scope and breadth of the market is. It's currently a $3.8 trillion market. These numbers are from the Federal Reserve as of December of 2017. It's up through the third quarter of 2017. Municipal bond market is a very, very active secondary market, meaning that investors can buy the bonds initially from the issuer, and if for whatever reason they need to sell those bonds, there is a secondary market available to them to sell them and find an additional buyer. In general terms, the types of investors that we're dealing with in the municipal market, we've kind of put it into two buckets, one being an institutional investor and the other being a retail investor. So for institutional investors, they may be things like money market funds, mutual funds. More recently, exchange-traded funds are examples of institutional investors, as are property and casualty insurance companies or banks, which have historically have been major buyers of municipal bonds. And I've got some statistics on the holders of bonds in a moment for you. But the single biggest component of the municipal market is our retail investors. Generally speaking, it's mom-and-pop type investors buying the bonds for their retirement account. So if you take a look on page 6, what I've done is I've given you, kind of broken down the holders of bonds as of December 2017, just to try to give you a little better understanding. So on the right-hand side, the blue piece of the pie there, households at 41%, the single largest segment of the market. But in orange, second at 24% is the combination of mutual funds, money market funds, exchange-traded funds, which really are retail investors as well. So 2/3 of the municipal market is made up of retail-type investors. And then followed by banks and credit unions, and then those property and casualty insurance companies at 15 and 14%. On page 7, what I've done is I've given you two charts here that show the types of issuers in the market and then the purpose of the bonds that they're issuing. So these are statistics from all of calendar 2017 issuance, excuse me. So the chart on the left, the single biggest issuer would be state government at 28%, followed by districts, which means school districts, at 21%. Local authorities at 16%, towns and cities at 13%. So again, when we say municipal bond market, it's not just local government, but it's going to be state agencies, all the way down to counties and parishes. On the right-hand side, we've given you a pie chart of the types of the use of the proceeds from those issuance. So that again, as you might expect, the single largest piece would be education, 28%, followed by general purpose. It's a bit of a catch-all. That would be things like fire stations, police departments, police vehicles, fire vehicles, public works vehicles, things of that nature. Transportation at 14%, and followed by healthcare at 11%. All right, so then if you move to page 8, talk about the security that you'd be maybe pledging to support the repayment of that debt. So really, there's two main types of securities that we're pledging here. Most commonly, and has been the town's practice, as well as the cities, has been to issue what we refer to as general obligation bonds. So in essence, you're pledging the full faith and credit of the town to repay that debt. It's important to understand it's not secured by a specific mortgage on any particular property or even the asset being financed. The idea here is that you're pledging to raise taxes to the level necessary to ensure that the debt is repaid. Right, and if you were to default, bondholders would have the right to take you to court to compel you to raise the taxes necessary to pay the debt. This is viewed by the market as being the most secure pledge, and therefore generally would produce the highest credit rating and the lowest borrowing cost to the issuer. On page 9, then, we'll talk about the other most common security for the bonds, which would be a revenue pledge. Here, this is a little bit different because you'd only be pledging the specific program revenues that to support the debt. So it's not your overall full faith and credit. What you're saying is, we're going to finance this facility or this enterprise. The revenues produced by the enterprise is all we're willing to pledge to support the bonds. Okay, so it's a limited revenue stream, and as a result, the bonds are viewed to be more risky, less secure, generally have a lower credit rating and a higher interest rate associated with them. So some examples of revenue bonds would be water or sewer systems, utility projects, and toll roads, most commonly. All right, then on page 10, just talk about a little bit about the specific debt instruments. So really there are two types of debt instruments that you may be issuing, either long-term debt instruments or bonds versus short-term debt instruments, which we'll refer to as notes. And this is now from a Connecticut, really based upon Connecticut statutes. Bonds generally have serial maturities or potentially term bonds ranging anywhere from 1 up to 30 years in maturity. Talk about what your local policy has been in a moment. Short-term notes are generally in Connecticut less than 2-year maturity. They can be less than a year. They could be 6 months, 9 months, depending upon the particular facts and circumstances. The notes may be renewed annually up to 10 years after the initial issuance date, but they're generally issued to finance expenses in anticipation of some future revenue. So we refer to them oftentimes as bond anticipation notes. We're issuing the notes in anticipation of a bond to permanently finance the note. Or in some instances, they may be a tax anticipation note. We're anticipating receiving some future taxes that will pay off the note at its maturity. So we talked a little bit about what a municipal bond is, why you may issue a bond. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the process of issuing bonds. So first, who are the players that are involved in the transaction? Obviously, the town or the city would be the issuer of the debt. Generally speaking, you'd be hiring both Judith's firm and my firm as municipal advisor and bond counsel. Again, my role is to help you access the capital markets, help you prepare the offering statement or prospectus that we're giving to the potential investors, assist with the credit rating. Judith's purpose is to make sure the bonds are duly authorized and issue a legal opinion that says to the investor, yes, the interest that you will receive on these bonds are going to be exempt from state and local taxes. And federal taxes, thank you. There will be an underwriter, which is typically a broker-dealer firm who's buying the bonds directly from you, the issuer, and then really wholesaling them to the investor. They're an intermediary between you and the ultimate investor of the bonds. And then some other parties to the transaction. There'll be a paying agent or a trustee that basically the bonds are we're no longer clipping coupons. For some of us who've been around a while, where you don't actually hold the physical certificate. It's a registered system now that is done through a clearinghouse, and so the paying agent is a banking entity that makes sure the money ends up in the hands of the ultimate investor. Credit rating agencies, which you're familiar with, and then potentially credit enhancers, which are bond insurers. It may be required depending upon the underlying credit strength of the issuer. So the borrowing process, so first and foremost, you identify the need. So you've put together your annual capital plan. You've identified that you don't have the resources available currently to finance this improvement. You're going to come to the council and then ultimately to the voters to obtain the legal authorization to issue the debt. Once that's been obtained, then staff and Judith and I will get together and work with the staff in determining the size of the issue, the term of the issue, whether it's short-term or long-term instruments, and then how that term is structured, ensuring that we're complying with state statutes. We'll help to develop again, the prospectus or official statement that goes out to the investors. We'll obtain a credit rating, and ultimately, or credit enhancements if bond insurance is deemed necessary or beneficial. Have the sale to the investor, and then the money comes in at settlement at closing. All right, so now on page 13, just talk a little bit about what the town's local capital funding policy is and has been historically. So the town has a debt policy. Stated in the debt policy is that you'll only issue debt to finance capital projects that have a useful life longer than 10 years. Anything that's reoccurring in nature or a small dollar value or less than that 10 years of useful life, you will finance through either current budget or through the use of a capital reserve fund. So the requirement that you've established in funding capital is that not less than 4% of your operating budget will be dedicated to funding capital. So that's a combination of the debt, the servicing the debt that you've already issued, as well as putting money into the capital reserve to fund those smaller or reoccurring type improvements. Under your policy, you've stated that you will not make an appropriation to the capital non-reoccurring account if the balance in that account is greater than 50% of the operating budget, the total operating budget, or the unappropriated balance is more than 12% of the general fund budget. Those are both pretty high thresholds. In my experience of working with the town, we're not anywhere close to these levels of capital reserves, so you continue to make an appropriation to that capital reserve annually. Also included in your policy are a number of affordability metrics, so we'll talk about those next. You've established 4 of these affordability metrics. The first says that the outstanding debt shall not exceed 50% of the statutory debt limit. And I'll quantify these numbers in a moment on the next 2 slides. But just to give you an overview quickly of what those affordability metrics are first, and then we'll talk about the actual numbers. So the second metric is to say the amount of debt that you have shall be no more than 5% of the full value of the grant list. So not assessed value, but the full actual market value of the grant list. Right, so again, both of these are pretty high numbers, and in a moment we'll demonstrate that your debt, thankfully, is nowhere approaching these levels. The third metric is to say that debt service shall not exceed 10% of the operating budget. So we said previously you've got a minimum of 4%, but it can't be more than 10%. And then finally, we want to ensure that we're not becoming over-leveraged. So we've established a metric that says 50% of your debt must be repaid within a 10-year period. Okay? So on page 15 and 16, then, what I've done is I've put some actual numbers to those affordability metrics. So first on 15, I've given you a list of both what is currently outstanding as of today for an outstanding bonded debt, which is a total of $38.3 million. And then we've included what has been authorized previously but is yet to be issued. So there's an additional, including the net amount of the town's obligation for the recently approved school initiative, a total of an additional, call it $90 million rounding up. So a total of $128 million of both current and future debt to be issued. It's important to understand one thing regarding state statutes and the issuance of debt. Even though for the school initiative, you may have, the voters approved $184 million, and you're authorized to issue up to $184 million, under state statute, you can only issue for your net share of the project cost. So if we're expecting to receive a certain amount of state grants, we can't issue the bonds in excess of that net share. We have to take that offsetting grant revenue into consideration to determine the net borrowing amount. That makes sense. So the $75 million that's reflected here is obviously much less than the total authorization that was intended, because you're expecting to receive some substantial amount of state aid for this project. So $128.2 million of both existing and pending debt issuance. So now on page 16, we'll look at those affordability metrics. So again, in lines 13 to 18 is both the current and proposed debt. On line 20, the debt limit, the statutory debt limit using the June 30, 17 numbers is actually $685 million. So under statute, you could issue up to $685 million of debt. Your local policy says you can't have more than 50% of that, which gets you down to $342 million. However, have only issued or proposing to issue 37% of that level. So thankfully, we're at quite a bit lower than what your policy would allow. The next metric is that debt, what we refer to as debt burden, or debt as a percentage of the full value of the grant list. Okay, so using this numbers from the state of Connecticut's Office of Policy and Management as a proxy for the full value of your grant list, is $4.9 billion. So we can issue up to 5% of that by local policy, which would be $245 million. Right, we're at 128, so we're safely below that metric as well. The third affordability metric, though, is one that we're a little closer to, and this one is really the one that it becomes the limiting factor in terms of putting a throttle on how much debt that you end up issuing. So here we're saying you can only have your annual debt service must not exceed 10% of your operating budget. So for the current year, the operating budget is, call it $119 million. That is be $11.9 million of debt service that you can have. Based upon the projections of what has been authorized up to date, the peak year of debt service would be in fiscal 23-24, and it would come in at a little over $11 million. So we would be at 9.3% of the current operating budget level. So we're, again, this metric, we're still below the 10% policy threshold, but we're much closer to that level. So of your affordability metrics, this is the one that's going to actually be the one that provides the handbrake to slow down the amount of borrowing you undertake. So if you're still awake, that's what we have.
We are. Is there anything else you want to add, or should we open it up to questions from the councilors? Do any of the councilors have questions for either the bond counsel or the financial advisor? Councilor Sheffield, and then
Yes, how you
Atwater.
doing? What would be the optimal I guess debt as percentage of council limited? I see that 37% what would be the optimal amount? Somewhere lower, around 20 to 25 would probably be a better figure, or?
Yeah, so when you say optimal, in what respect? From a credit rating perspective, or from the taxpayers? You know, what your appetite is to pay? Because at the end of the day, the statutory debt limit that is, again, is established by statute is excessive. It's very, very high, and no one in the state of Connecticut approaches that.
Only the tiny communities in the northern corners that have populations under 1,000.
Yeah. So from that perspective, you're not going to those metrics. You're not going to get to that. What's going to become the limiting factor, quite honestly, is what your tolerance to service the debt through the mill.
Councilor Atwater?
I have three questions, and the first one has to do with this last page. If we've got three, what I'll call stopgap measures or guides or whatever, why are two of them so open and the last one is so tight?
That's a good question. I think that I was not involved in the crafting of your debt policy, so I don't know what the council at the time, what their thought process was there. The percentage of the statutory debt limit, I think it's an effort to be conservative, to give you an outside upper limit as to the amount of debt. The second measure, the debt burden, the 5% of the full value of the grand list, that's more of a credit-driven metric. And so here again, 5% would be probably considered moderate to high. So from guidance from the credit rating agencies, 5% is at least moderate. And so again, I imagine that the thought process was what can we borrow up to and still have it not negatively affect our credit rating, and that's kind of where that level was drawn.
Okay, which leads into my next question. On the bond rating, a few previous pages, you said that if we go out with a new issue, you get a rating of the bond. Is that the same as the bond rating for the town that's done by Moody's or whatever?
Yes, exactly.
It is the same, okay.
Yep.
And my third question, way back in the beginning, you made a statement of something to the effect that, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but my question was, is it possible at times, I guess borrowing for a project or having a reserve fund or capital improvement fund, isn't it make sense at sometimes because of low interest rates to borrow the money now and fund the project or buy the equipment or whatever because of inflationary costs, that if you wait a year or 2 years, it's going to cost you that much more?
That's one way to look at it, yes. And there we do have issuer clients who do consider that in their decision making as to what projects they're going to fund through cash or what projects they're going to borrow for. Your policy doesn't necessarily speak to that and doesn't give guidance as to what maybe a range of rates on the high side or the low side to do that. But it does speak to thresholds in terms of useful life. And so the one thing to consider as you move forward and maybe revisit the policy is, you're going to lose some of that flexibility by saying anything less than a 10-year average life, you're going to finance through cash, regardless of where you are in the interest rate cycle.
Okay, and I guess I'm thinking too that in my previous community, the fire chief had a sinking fund or a capital improvement fund for a fire truck, and he had one more year to go. And the rates were so low, it made much more sense to go to the bank and borrow that last amount of money, purchase the fire truck, rather than wait another year when the cost was going up. So it seems like that's something that we should consider.
Right. It absolutely, that's a valid point. Again, assuming that the asset we're financing is above that 10-year useful life threshold, right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Are there other questions from any of the councilors? Well, thank you very much for coming out. I think this was a good educational basis for all of us to start with, and we will keep this going forward. All right, next item on the agenda is tax increment financing, and I believe we have Planning Director Reiner with us this evening. While we're waiting, could everybody in the audience silence your devices, please? I think everyone up here has their silence. It sounded like it came from out there somewhere. I don't want people at home to think we're all on our phones up here. Thank you. So this is John Reiner, Planning and Development Director.
Good evening, everyone. So we're going to go from talking about complex financing mechanisms and policies to more complex financing mechanisms and policies, but not quite. Tax increment financing, which is what we'll talk about briefly tonight, although at first blush may seem very complex, as you break it down and dive into each of the layers, it's actually not all that complex. So I think the questions that had been brought up that folks wanted me to kind of touch over tonight is how are we going to move forward with adopting tax increment financing, or TIF, within the town and in the city, because some of that, there's going to be some overlap in how we move forward with it. So really the main item, one step back, TIF programs do not impact existing taxes paid to the town and only apply to an increment of new taxes if and when new development is completed. So every time I get up and have the chance to talk about TIF, I keep saying no new taxes, and this is revenue that wouldn't happen but for the tax increment financing program, because folks have had some questions about, well, we're taking taxes from one area and putting them somewhere else. Without TIF, we wouldn't be getting that development. So I just gotta put that kind of my public service announcement there for you. Three main mechanisms we're going to talk about tonight: the Tif Policy, the Tif Master Plans, and then the preferred financing mechanism, which for the town right now is the Credit Enhancement Agreement. Right now, we've been working on a Tif Policy for a number of months, probably close to a year. We've been working on that in conjunction between both the city and the town. We have a public hearing set for February 27th at 6 p.m. before the town council to talk about the TIF policy. So the TIF policy, that sets the general framework for how we use TIF in town, what the adoption process is, how we go and establish the TIF master plans, and our preferred financing mechanisms in the case of what we're looking at, these credit enhancement agreements, to minimize exposure or any risk to the town. The town adopts that TIF policy. Once we have that in place, the city should also adopt a TIF policy. They could adopt the exact same policy that we have, changing town to city. If they want to make some modifications to it, they certainly can, but I would certainly encourage that the two policies stay as close and consistent as possible, because we want to send a clear message and a clear process to developers if we want to encourage development in these areas. So that's the general, so the TIF policy outlines the process of planning for, reviewing, and approving and implementing the TIF districts. That's the policy. Any questions on the policy before I jump into the next steps? Or I can keep going and then we could always circle back. I'm getting a few head nods there. Okay. Once the town and the city both adopt a policy, which is after a public hearing separately by the city and the town council, we'll then be looking at our TIF master plans. So we're proposing currently 2 TIF master plans within the city, one at Route 1 downtown, the other one being at the intersection of 184, 117, Center Groton. We will develop a master plan which sets the boundaries, which parcels of land are going to be in that area. What are the items that we can use to finance? What are the types of projects? So is it streetscape projects, improvements to public parks or future public parks, water line extensions, sewer line extensions, and the list goes on. We would define those things generally within the TIF master plan for that district. For each district, we would do that same thing. Now, within the town, we also have separate fire taxing districts. We are not going to incorporate the fire tax district into the master plans. Fire taxes will be assessed and paid for as they normally are. We're only dealing with the town taxes in those districts. Those will be done, again, public hearings, referrals to boards and commissions within the town. Generally, pretty easy. Once we get to the master plans within the city, a little bit more complex, because now the 2 taxing districts there, that both the city and the town with a higher mill rate across the board, the city with a lower mill rate. As we look to develop those master plans, well, that's within the city zone and within their general governmental purview. We will look to them to set the boundaries of each of those TIF districts. What parcels of land do you want to include in the district that we think we want to encourage economic development that will be consistent with our general town and city policies for moving economic development forward? Also, you don't have to take too crazy in notes, because I did put a memo together on this, but it's not as perfect as I'd like it. So you will be getting that in the next few days. Sorry I didn't have it in advance. You'll set the boundaries of the districts. Also, again, those types of programs. What do you want to use that TIF funding for within those districts? The city and the town should generally agree on the boundaries of the districts, the items that we want to utilize for the funding of those districts. And then, as far as the adoption of those master plans, the city and the town each need to refer to the appropriate boards and committees, hold a public hearing, and then adopt those master plans. We could actually have a joint public hearing just to meet the requirements, the statutory requirements for each of those two city-town TIF districts for those master plans, and then after the public hearings, adopt those master plans based on any feedback we receive and direction from both the town and the city council. So that's the policy, one policy for the town, very similar policy for the city. The master plans, there'll be 4 of them, 2 in the town, 2 within the city. The 2 within the town, just the town adopts. The 2 within the city, both the town and the city need to adopt those. Ideally, it's one policy, one master plan for each of those districts that we're adopting for those in the city. I should also put another caveat in there for those city master plans. We want to have a provision in there, basically a separation agreement. So if we decide to get divorced, who gets the kids? If one of the parties, the town or the city, decides, no, we don't want to do TIF anymore within the city, how do we keep moving forward? Because if the town says, we don't want to do it, but the city says, we want to keep continuing to do it, the city could, based on their tax rate and utilizing that, and vice versa. So that's something, we just want to cover our bases. Hopefully we won't hit that point, but just in case. So that's the policy, the master plan. The next is where the rubber hits the road, the credit enhancement agreement, or the other types of funding mechanism that'll actually dictate. We have a developer that comes in, they're going to be investing over $1 million, that was the kind of baseline number that we used, into a property. Well, how much of that future tax revenue goes towards TIF, and how much of it goes towards the general fund? Those are the 2 pots of money we want to think about. Once we say, all right, we want 50% of the revenue, of the future revenue, to go towards the TIF and 50% to go to the general fund, of that 50% of the total new increment of the tax that's going to the TIF, how much of that has to go towards paying back any obligations under that credit enhancement agreement, i.e., what's the shortfall that developer needs to make up to make this development happen, and then what leftover piece can we put into a general TIF account for that TIF district, that there might be other general public municipal improvements we want to do. So maybe it's not up to the developer to improve the whole streetscape there, just a general example. That's something that over time, with those earmarked TIF funds, if it's consistent with that master plan, we would then utilize some of that funding for that. The money that goes to the general fund for either the city or the town budget, every year as you adopt your budget or your capital improvement program, that is how you would dictate how that money is used with anything else in the general fund. We don't want to start setting money from the general fund aside into certain little pockets, because it becomes difficult to account for. So that's our general overview of tax increment financing and how we go through the steps. So not super complex, but once you get your arms around it, it's not too bad. It's not a totally daunting task. So, and then timeline, I expect to have master plans in draft form before the town council, probably within the next 3 months or so, from the time of the policy, maybe even sooner. The city, we've been working with the mayor, with the planner, with the finance director there. We expect to probably move a policy forward within a few months, and then shortly thereafter, the master plans. Any questions?
There's got to be questions on this. Are there questions on this? Councilor Aubrey.
I have a couple. Can the areas be expanded in the future? Thank you.
Yes, they can be. Again, we would just go through the same process for amending the master plans as we did with the initial adoption of them. So referrals to Planning and Zoning Commission, Economic Development Commission, whichever referral types we actually lay out within the policy, we would follow that same procedure. a public hearing. There are some requirements as far as the times between the initial referral and when you can hold the public hearing as dictated by state law. But otherwise, yes, we can revisit these areas. Initially, we want to start them off small, not too small, but right-size them. And then if they're very successful and we see some of these areas could or should grow, we can revisit those areas and add additional parcels.
Could you
Oh.
add to that the percentages?
Could you come over, please?
Sure.
That way we can capture what you're saying for the public to hear. People actually do watch these things.
Thought I had a mom's voice. You could hear me.
Thank you.
And Barbara, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Barbara Goodrich. I'm the planning director in the City of Groton. About the 10% value.
Yes. So one of the things, so we can't, very good point. When we're looking to establish TIF districts, so we're establishing 4 TIF districts initially within the town and the city. There's a maximum amount of area by valuation that you can establish as a TIF district. It can only be 10% of your total assessed value of the town. Now, fortunately, we have 2 very large companies within the town that help boost up our overall tax base, Pfizer and EB. So we have a lot of room to grow our TIF districts, but the maximum total, it's not area, but the total area of our TIF districts is really limited by that financing. So we can't go above 10% of our total assessed value within all of our TIF districts.
And is that the total assessed value, or, and is that the assessed value, the 75% or the 100%?
That is the total assessed value, the 70%. So it's based on whatever our assessor sets the total grand list of the town at.
Thank you, Jim.
All right.
Did I answer all of your questions, Councilor Aubrey?
At the moment,
Okay.
I'm still trying to get my head around how you actually do this. I'm looking for the funnel. I'm trying to figure out how that money comes. Have you all figured that out?
It goes this way.
It's this way?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
down. As the value of the properties go up, the assessed value, that is the TIF funds.
I see the difference
So-
for what it was when it started and then what it becomes.
Right.
And that money that is being taxed becomes the TIF fund.
Yes, or a percentage of it.
Yeah.
Or
whatever we
percentage
set.
of it, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. You got it around the right way for me now.
Councilors-
And then a
1
portion
minute,
of
Councilor
that
Barry.
we'll set aside to go into the general fund, and a portion of that goes towards the TIF fund.
Councilor Zepari and then Councilor Carter.
And considering the total assessed value, are you considering the town in its entirety, including the city, or do you consider the assessed value within the city separate from the assessed value within the town without the city?
I believe when we looked at that for the town, we looked at the entire town. When we looked at the city, we were looking at just the city. So when the city master plans are being put together, they need to look at 10% of the total value of the city.
And that would be all the assessed property within the city? That would
Yes.
include EB and Pfizer? And,
Yes.
okay.
And we can double check on that particular item, just because we are a little unique in that the town and the city are one municipality. The city is essentially, it's more than a borough, but that's something that we can always relook at, but that's the general direction we've gotten thus far.
Councilor Carter?
So it's the total assessed? No, it's not the areas that you're looking at. But you said there's 4 designated areas, right?
Correct.
There's 4 designated areas?
As of now.
2 in the town, 2 in the city?
Correct.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, 5 corners in the city in section of Thames Street?
Yes.
And where's the town location?
Route 1, downtown, kind of the Big Y and Benny's, that general area, and then the other being the intersection of Route 117 and 184, so
Okay.
center Groton.
All right, and as far as taxes go, it's a total assessment, it's not those specific areas?
Correct,
that
so-
are- Oh, okay.
Yeah, so each of those 4 areas cannot add up to more than 10% of the total assessed value of the town.
Okay. Okay. And once this goes on, and you mentioned like separating, you know, steps from.
Yes.
So once this goes on, right, and say the town backed out, they would back out on their 2 sections or whatever proposed. This is a proposal?
No, so the only reason we would have to do some type of clause in the master plans would be in relation to the city, the two that are in the city, because you have two different basically negotiating parties. So if a developer comes in and wants to do something, a development within the city on Thames Street, theoretically, Barbara and I would be negotiating with that developer of, all right, here, she would be dealing with the land use, the planning, the zoning, but from a financial, and it wouldn't just be Barbara and I, it would be the town manager, the mayor, the finance directors, it would be a larger team. All right, what is your funding shortfall? And from that, there would be a piece of that the city would be covering through their TIF, the town, a piece of that financing through our TIF, and that would then be incorporated into that credit enhancement agreement. That is a legally binding document, and it's going to set us in place for 10 years, 20 years. If they can go up to 50 years, we're not proposing to do that. I think the maximum we put in there was 30 years within our policy, but we can't just year 5 say, oh, we're not paying anymore. So once the credit enhancement agreement's in place, that continues on. As far as if we wanted to say, we're all done doing TIF, that would be for future TIFs.
Yeah, and the reason why we're doing this, as you stated, I believe, before, is that it's cheaper going in together, right? As far as the town and the city?
This is, well, I mean, there's a number of reasons, yes. I mean, from a consultant's point of view, it makes sense when we're hiring outside experts to do this jointly.
Yeah.
This doesn't really work if we're not doing it together. I mean, this is something we have to work on together because we're both parties at the table. We need to, this is a great opportunity for good cooperation to get the development that we all want to see happen within the town and the city. These are also developments that wouldn't happen without TIF. Tax increment financing is, I'd say, hands down, the best economic development tool that we have the ability to use. This is the game changer.
Good job explaining that to us.
Any other first-time questions before we go to second-time questions? I have one, then we'll get to you, Councilor Zepari.
I'm offended.
I apologize. So you mentioned 3 steps, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said when we get to the master plan stage, that's when you recommend the joint public hearing?
And that's something we certainly can do, yes.
Okay.
Just for the 2 TIF districts within the city.
Okay, and is that's the thing that we're looking at 3 months out? This is not the thing that we have coming up, the policy hearing, correct? This is a separate thing from the policy hearing?
Correct, this is separate.
So we
from
have
the-
time to get that in place?
Yes.
Okay.
And honestly, the TIF master plans from the city are probably closer to 6 months out.
Okay.
And I would not recommend the joint, holding out for a joint, if it's going to hold the town up from implementing the master plans. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's all kind of coming down to timing.
Yeah.
Great, that's good to know, thank you.
And those, just so I add a little clarity, those joint hearings, those would only be for the individual specific plans within the city. So when we, 3 months from now, give or take a little bit of time, if we present to you a master plan for 184 and 117 and one for downtown Groton Route 1, we can move forward with master plans for each of those and get those moving, get those implemented. At the same time, we'll be working with the city to finalize the master plan for Thames Street and for 5 Corners. I would not advise that the town adopt master plans for either of those districts until the city has dotted every I, crossed every T, and they are 100% on board, because, again, those are within the city. I would recommend we adopt their master plan, or it's our master plan for both of those districts, as opposed to having something different.
So we as the town then can move ahead on our end, because
Yes.
if we have people ready to go and that want to do things with us, we can move ahead with those and then catch up with you when you guys are ready to go.
Yes.
Okay, Councilor Zepari.
I was just curious about the 10% limit, the 10% of the grand list. A TIF project can't exceed that. If we were to have 4 TIF zones and we have $5 billion in grand list, That would mean that the total of 4 TIF zones could not involve investment of more than $500 million in the town. Am I correct?
Depending on, and it's also based on the assessment today.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that this builds in a restriction as to how much money can be invested into Groton.
No, it sets just how big a district can be today. Once
talking about
more
the district
investment
size.
comes in, if we start adopting more districts or expanding our districts, then the investment that was in place, that new investment, then that can start getting factored into that bigger piece.
How do you calculate the valuation of the district? Do you take the grand list and divide it by the surface area of the town, or how do you do this?
No, it's looking at the grand list of the town, parcel by parcel basis, and then we take out the 20, 30, 50 parcels within that master plan area, add up the total assessed value of all of those, and there's your value for one, and you repeat that for the other 3.
I see, okay. It doesn't limit the amount that can go in it, it limits the amount that can be put at risk.
Yes.
Okay.
Also, this is something that we've been working very diligently with the town tax assessor on, again, finance directors. I was trying to keep it as simple as I could process-wise.
John, believe me, I'm not questioning your diligence.
Yeah.
I want to get my mind around this thing,
Yes.
too.
And Mayor Hedrick wanted to speak.
Thank you. Yeah, the town is a little further along in the process than we are. So we're going to leverage off what the town is doing now. We're using Camoin to help us out and to work on the master plan. So the intent is not to hold the town back or tie up the town, but we identified during a meeting that we had between the planners and me and Camoin that we are tied together because of the 2 different tax rates in the city. Whether or not we hold 2 separate public hearings or whether we hold 1 public hearing, that's to be determined based on how far along we are. But we are continuing to work, you guys are continuing to work, and then we'll address it as we go along. My commitment is that we are committed, the city is committed to working with the town on the taxing districts and back and forth. So this is a positive thing because any economic development that we have, either in the city or the town, rising tide floats all boats. So it's a positive thing no matter how it's going to work. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Agreed. Are there any other comments or questions about TIF for the 2 planning directors? Councilor Aubrey.
I just kind of wanted to go back to the question that Joe had asked about calculating the base, and it would seem to me like for the calculation of the base, it's got to be the whole town. I don't think it could be divided, because then I think it might, one might come up higher, one might come up lower, whatever. We're looking for an even program, I think, throughout the town. Am I making sense with the question that I'm?
You are. I think little apples and oranges right now, though. I mean,
Okay.
How the financing happens, we'll figure that out on as we negotiate those credit enhancement agreements. The questions that he was asking was more just what's the maximum, and some of what you were saying, can you expand the district? What's the maximum or total area that we can have for those districts, town and citywide? That's based on our current assessed value of the entire grand list. Difference between the city and the town, devil's within the details. I don't see that as a limiting factor, nor will that impact the financing or tax rates of developments. That's just, it will be a limiting factor 10 or 20 years from now if we want to keep growing the size of our TIF districts.
Okay.
Yes.
Are there any negatives to this? Sorry.
I'm sorry, Councilor Rusk.
Okay, are there any negatives to this?
There can always be negatives. So when people ask about the negatives, some of the examples they'll bring up is, well, TIF failed in California. California has an incredibly complex taxing, how they fund, just forget about TIFs, just how they deal with taxing and then repayment back to the municipalities. And there, they used TIF for a while very successfully, and then it didn't work so well, and they stopped utilizing tax increment financing in the very recent past. A lot of that had to do with, or some of that had to do with, oh, well, let's take a little bit of that TIF funding and let's stick it in this special account for whatever, for road improvement. And let's take a little bit of it and put it in this one. From general funds, once you start getting too complex with how you are spending the money or putting it in different buckets to spend, you can restrict yourself in a way that you don't need to. Again, that's why I said every year when you're looking at your budget, your capital improvement programs, that's how you want to lay out how you're spending your money. Whether it's money that comes from the TIF that goes into the general fund or just from your general tax collection dollars. When we're looking at funds that are utilized from the TIF that then go into the TIF pot, whether that's paying back the credit enhancement agreements or for other general TIF expenses, all those expenses have to be consistent with the master plan for that district. Another mechanism that there could be some risk is if you decided to say, all right, we're going to do a bond for this project. A developer wants to build a sewer line, we're going to bond for it. The town and the city bond for that project, we build the sewer line, and the development goes flop and it never happens. What we've said in our policy, and we'll continue to say this, is our preferred method of financing these is the credit enhancement agreement. The credit enhancement agreement requires that the developer pay any of those infrastructure costs up front. They build their development, and then once they build their development and we are collecting taxes from them, once we have those taxes in hand, then we can pay back the developer with the taxes that they've already paid us. If they don't build it, and if they don't pay taxes, they don't get any money back from us. So we're taking a little bit more of a conservative approach. Yeah, if we wanted to really open the floodgates, hey, let's bond, let's do this, we're not there. I'm a more cautious person with my money and with all of your money. So.
And we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Councilor Schmidt.
Thank you. Are there other communities, other municipalities that have used this TIF fund so that we would be able to check to see how it has worked out in other places other than California?
Yes.
I've had quite a bit of experience with TIF in Michigan. It's heavily used there. And in terms of having any risk, one of the most important things is to have a good agreement in place. Like we cleaned up a brownfield site, a former city dump. We ended up having a construction company move in there, and part of their taxes was based a lot on personal property through all their equipment. They didn't put as much equipment there as they intended. It started to look like they weren't going to generate as much revenue. But we had a good agreement in place. Look, you're going to pay it one way or another, and they ended up moving all the equipment there. But you know, we've used it many times there very successfully, and you just have to make sure that you hit every detail in your agreements and make sure you're covered. So.
Also, within the state of Maine, they've very much utilized tax increment financing. Our consulting firm on this, Camoin, has done probably the majority of the TIFs within the state of Maine. A lot of success there. We've seen them utilized in Connecticut before and other areas within New England. I think all the ones that have been done in Connecticut were done under the previous state law, which the municipality had to get approval from the state in order to enact the TIF. The state law changed about 2 years ago, and it lets us be in charge of our own domain on this, so we don't need state approval in order to adopt tax increment financing within the city and town.
Councilor Atwater, did you want to address anything with your Maine experience? Okay.
Coming from Maine, I agree that it has been used very successfully. We did not use it in my little community, but it has been used, yes.
Are there any other first-time questions before we go to second-time questions? Councilor Over.
How attractive is this to developers?
Incredibly. One of the things that I fear is most of the good developments that we get in the future, that we're already hearing it, oh, I need tax increment financing to make this work. Are you in a proposed TIF district? No, but it sounds really good. No, we're not. We're utilizing this to be consistent with our plans of conservation and development in our growth areas, in our areas that we really want to see revitalized. I think this is incredibly attractive to developers.
It's so incredibly attractive that I've already had 3 people call to say that they've saw the agenda packet and what does it mean for them. But we have to stress the but for. This is not a program that's readily available to every single person who wants to come through. This is for special cases where this is one of the triggers that brings it over the edge so that it actually will work for communities. So it's attractive as in that kind of respect, bringing in new development who's willing to take this chance.
And also, they need to show us their books. They need to show us that there's a funding gap, that this development wouldn't happen but for us, public-private partnership, helping to close that financing gap. If this is something that would be able to, if a development could happen on its own without TIF, well, then they don't need TIF, and we're not going to give them a TIF. And that's something that both our internal and external experts will be looking at that with the fine-tooth comb. The end bodies that approve those credit enhancement agreements are the city and town council.
Are there any other questions? All right, thank you very much for talking to us about this. We appreciate that.
And if you have any questions, please email me. I think we're going to start putting together a more in-depth TIF fact sheet, and the more questions we get from people, instead of sending an email out to this one or that one, we want to compile a list, put something together so people can understand it.
Put the funnel in. Then they'll understand.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so the last item on the agenda is disposition of empty schools, which everybody's interested in. So who wants to talk about this?
Yeah. Oh, that one's my baby also.
Mr. Reiner's also talking to us about that.
So the main schools that we wanted, I think the councils wanted to hear about, briefly we can touch upon the Mystic Education Center, Groton Heights, Sealy, and then Colonel Ledyard, Pleasant Valley, and then in the future there will be 2 additional empty schools that still have students in them today. So generally what we've been doing, the way we've been marketing these properties, so I'll use the example of the Mystic Education Center. We've been actively marketing that property, meaning showing it to developers, putting ads in the paper, going to ICSC, so retail and other business conventions, and talking about these properties. For the Mystic Ed Center, we've been doing that for over a year. About 2 months ago, we finally issued the request for proposals, not just the highest bidder, but very clear specifications on what are we looking for, the types of development, showing that you have secure financing, the process you're going to take. We don't want somebody to just come along, buy it, and land bank it and sit on it for 10 years, showing us that you have the ability to build some type of development. We had that RFP open for 2 months. We received a number of very good proposals. I'm not going to, because we haven't gotten to the negotiation standpoint or even the grading, those are all things to talk about in executive session. We will then continue through that process, working with a committee, picking out a preferred developer for that property, discussing that with the town council in executive session, entering into a purchase and sales agreement with that preferred developer, and then helping guide them through the development process, through planning and zoning, through construction, and getting the project all approved and ready to go. And then at that time executing, or somewhere in there, the purchase and sales agreement. If they decide that, oh, I'm not going to build the project, or I'm just going to sit on it, there'll be reverter clauses in the purchase and sales agreement, again, to prevent someone from just sitting on this and land banking it. So total process for each one of these schools could be from marketing to selecting that preferred developer could be a year plus. Then the development process sometimes can take, I mean, we've all seen how long planning and zoning sometimes takes, not for any fault of our own, just the designing, the engineering. It's all very complex stuff. That will take some additional time. So that's the Mystic Education Center. The next property that we've been working on, Groton Heights. Again, that piece we've been showing it, advertising it, marketing it for months. We expect an RFP for that property to come out late spring, probably the latest June of 2018. Putting it out there for about 2 months' time, getting proposals in. We've had a tremendous amount of interest in that property. and then getting those in, going through that same process as I just kind of laid out with the Mystic Education Center. I'll skip Sealy School for a moment. For the other properties, for Pleasant Valley, for Colonel Ledyard, we would be doing the same thing. So one of the tricks here is we really can't start processing the property until I get these. I need the keys to the building. I need a letter from the school department saying, all right, town, we're giving you back Pleasant Valley, or in the instance of Colonel Ledyard, the city saying, all right, we don't want it anymore, town, here it is. Once we have the keys, then we can begin showing the property, we can really begin marketing the property. We want to build interest and we want to build value in the town, and those things take time. We don't want to start talking up properties with people and then lo and behold, oh, we changed our minds, we don't want to market this property, we don't want to make this excess. That'll leave egg on our face as the town is acting as an economic development agent moving these initiatives forward. But each one will be kicking off probably 4 to 5 months after an RFP is due. And we'll just keep picking away at each of these, and there's a number of them. The reason I said I was skipping Sealy is because right now we're working with the abutting property owner, so that's a little bit of a different process, trying to get a realtor involved to help us, because it's not just us, it's us and someone else. So having that partnership there, again, one of these public-private partnerships, makes it a little bit more complex. That's kind of the general overview of how we've been doing this. It's not as simple as just putting an RFP out like we would for if we have old, police vehicles that we want to dispose of. We need to take the time to drum up interest, get the word out, not just in southeastern Connecticut, but New York, the Boston market, the larger regional market. Those are the areas where we want to bring the investors here and get them interested in Groton. And again, some of these things, I know people are tired of looking at empty buildings on some of these. EB's full ramp up is somewhere around 2022. That's when we want to have a number of these already constructed. That's when we want it. So we have some time. We don't want to get lax and lazy through there, but that's our goal, to have a number of things reconstructed in private hands, built by then or before then, so that we can meet that when that big hiring is in place, so those folks that are going to be working at EB can live in Groton.
Thank you. Are there questions about the excess pool
I
properties?
have a comment.
Yes.
It is my intent to send a letter to the town manager on Colonel Ledyard School, either by the end of this month or early in March. There was some furniture and equipment that needed to be removed from there. We have a plan for doing that to meet the end of this month. And as soon as that is out of there, then we'll turn it back over. The roof was fixed. I know the previous town council had a concern about a blight complaint that had been made. The blight issues have been completed, and the town will be held harmless in regards to that. So that should not be an issue. But as soon as we complete, I will write the letter to turn it back over to the town.
Excellent, thank you. And a couple of things I didn't touch upon in that general process. I was more kind of overview of marketing, but both in the case of like Colonel Ledyard or the Groton Heights, those properties are within the city. We don't have planning and zoning oversight, nor does our plan of conservation and development, our long-range plan for the town, address the city. So for Groton Heights, before we started marketing the property, we talked to the city. What are you looking for uses there? What can we do? How do we address the zoning there? So for Groton Heights, we actually crafted up a new zoning text amendment, worked with Barbara, worked with the mayor, got that through, got that adopted. That can be utilized for Groton Heights. That can also be utilized for Colonel Ledyard, depending on the future use of that property. We look at the Sealy School. We changed the zoning for that property also. When we look at the Mystic Education Center, once we know what the end use is, and if it's compatible, we'll be reaching back out to the neighbors. We'll be having to go through the planning and zoning process. As part of that, there will most likely be a zone change as part of that. So a lot of moving pieces, but all this requires partnership between the town, the city, the residents of the town.
Are there any other questions?
And a little patience.
I got an easy one for you. What's RFT stand for?
RFP.
RFP,
P.
Request for Proposals.
All right.
Sorry, as
Everybody
planners and our
throws it
acronyms.
around all the time. I figure it's nice once in a while to say what we're looking for.
Yes, yes. See, with tax increment financing, I'm trying not to say TIF all the time because I don't want to lose people. I'll remember that on request for proposals.
All right. Well, I think, Councilor Franco, yes.
We're not repairing and fixing up these schools to sell them, are we?
No, generally no. In some instances, the Sealy School I expect to be knocked down. Some of the other schools, it could be the same Pleasant Valley. Most likely will get knocked down.
And you had to repair a roof?
Well, yes, because when the city leased the Colonel Ledyard from the town, the original intent was to occupy it. So there were leaks in the roof, so we repaired that. We also put some money in some HVAC, but some events occurred and the decision was made not to occupy Colonel Ledyard. And so since I've been the mayor, one of the things that I was interested in is, why do we still have it? What are we doing with it? What do we need to do in order to get out of the way so that we can turn it back over to the town? I'd sent a letter once before, and then I found out once I sent the letter that there was some desk and furniture and things like that were in there, and we need to get that out of there. Because I'm not turning that back over to you because it wasn't there when we originally got it. So you will have it, like I said, there was concerns about, does it have water sprinklers? Nope, it doesn't have sprinklers. It didn't have sprinklers then. When we got it, it doesn't have sprinklers now. There were some windows that were broken. We have boarded up all the windows. We maintain the grass area beside it. We maintain it cut, so there's no blight issue anymore. And like I said, the town will be held harmless for any of those issues.
Okay.
So,
More? So William Sealy, I know it's a different situation, but when it's completely evacuated, everybody's out of there, it's done, are we going to keep the sprinkler systems going and heat going? And
I expect we will mothball the building, shut the heat off, drain the sprinklers out. Again, I'll work with the Public Works Director on and the Fire Marshals, so what's right, so it's not a vandalism potential hazard or something like that. But we don't plan on continuing to heat the building.
okay, thank you.
Councilor Moravsik?
What's the timeline for the Pleasant Valley School? I know it's still under the Board of Education, but they should certainly have a plan to turn it over to the town and remove their equipment so that that school could be marketed.
I just recently reached out to the superintendent today, actually, to check in to see what their timeline is. So we'll know that soon.
Anyone else? All right, seeing none, thank you again.
All right, thank you.
And that is all that is on our joint meeting with the City of Groton. And again, we thank you for coming out, and we look forward to meeting with you every quarter just to keep abreast of what's going on. And at this point, we're going to recess for 5 minutes so that we can take care of the microphones and get everybody set, and we'll be right back with you in 5. Thank you. We'll reconvene the special committee of the whole meeting. And we have 2 additional items, but I would need someone to move to suspend the rules for this item.
I make the motion to suspend the rules.
Go ahead.
Motion to suspend the rules.
Microphone, please.
I hereby move pertinent to Town Council Rules, Section 7B, to suspend the council rules and allow the council to add public art to the agenda for discussion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Overy, seconded by Parker to suspend the rules to add public art to the agenda for discussion. All those in favor of suspending the rules in order to add public art to the agenda say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? So moved unanimously. All right, so we have added public art to the agenda this evening. And this came about because of two things that happened rather coincidentally in the same week. I received contact from the woman who was the force behind the subtrail this past week, expressing interest in having another public art project for the town. At the same time, I received a letter from Bloomberg Philanthropies detailing a grant program where they award substantial amounts of money to municipalities for public art. So we started discussing these things, and I asked the manager if it would be all right if we brought this up with you this evening to see if there's any interest in pursuing something like this. So there are two ways that this can go. The Bloomberg Philanthropies grant is rather large, and they do big picture items. They don't do like icon trails. Like the sub trail is like an icon trail. It would not be to fund something like that. It would be for a bigger project, and there's an idea for a project floating around out there that would require a great deal of money. That would mean that we would have to have somebody on the town's staff that would write the application for the grant. So the first thing would be for the manager to take a look at what is needed to write the grant, to see if there's someone available at this busy time of year, budget time, if there's anyone available that would be able to write a grant. And if that is the case, then at that point we would come back and we would meet with people to say, this is the idea, do you all like the idea, and go forward from there. So if that's okay with you, we can ask the manager to see if there's someone who could write a grant for the Bloomberg thing. Do you have any feedback on that?
Good idea.
Second.
Well, go ahead.
So my question is, we're going to do a large art event, is that what you're saying?
That's what Bloomberg does. They don't do small scale. The subtrail is relatively small scale, which would be, to do another one would require like $50,000 in seed money, which is a large amount of money, but that's not what Bloomberg does.
Mm-hmm.
Bloomberg does like $1 million grants.
And that was the subtrail, was it just in Groton?
Yes.
Right. So the larger one, I mean, are we going to discuss what that is before we apply for the grant?
Yes, but we have to find out if there's anybody available to even write the grant. So the idea is, should we go, if we ask the manager to find out if there's anybody who has time to even write a grant, and if he says yes there is, then at that point we'll bring people in and say, what do you think of this? Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Are we good?
You got it
So-
together, Patrice.
So then, Mr.
Go,
Manager, then, okay. And the other thing with the Icon Trail, as I said, it would be about $50,000 that we'd have to come up with in order to do an Icon Trail again. And I don't know that this is a year for that, so perhaps next year we can plan for another Icon Trail, because I know everybody loved that. So, go ahead.
I had, not understanding it completely, when I responded to it, I thought that it should be a joint project. That if in fact we were going to go for a grant, that I thought we might have a better chance if it was done with the Groton Town, Groton City, and New London, just as the riverfront project has gone forward. By having the energies of all, it seems to have worked a lot better than trying to do something like that singularly. Just a thought, but I didn't realize there was I think we need to talk more about the second option. Isn't there a second option, the one that the girl from Votech was really talking about?
Yes, and that is the one that, so the Bloomberg Philanthropies grant has to come from a single entity. So it can't come from a regional thing. So it would have to come originally either from the manager, the chief administrator of the municipality, or from the mayor of the municipality.
Oh,
so
okay.
it can't be a regional application to get the bigger funding for the project. So really, I think the first step is to find out if anybody has the time to write a grant at this point. Yes.
Two things, Patrice. One, it would seem to me as though if we knew what this project was going to be, it might determine whether or not you want to take the time to have somebody write a grant, rather than just saying, well, we have somebody that can write a grant, so now we'll do this. And that's, I don't know if you're putting the cart before the horse or not, but, and the other thing is, if it has to be a single entity that applies for the grant, does it have to be for the benefit of just that community or
It has to be more than just purely aesthetic. It has to tie in with somehow benefiting the community. And that's why it would be something that would be tied to creating a sense of place in Groton, which is what the Planning and Development Office, that's one of the things they're really focusing on, is creating that sense of place. So the idea is it would be a project that would be ongoing that would contribute to creating the sense of place in Groton and actually in part of the TIF district. So I think it would fit well. I would rather not speak for the project at this point until we know it's something that we're interested in. And then I can have the person come in and talk to everybody about it.
Okay, is there a project that somebody has in mind somewhere?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we don't know about the project, but we would be asking to go forward if we have the availability for a grant?
All we're trying to find out now is if there's anybody on staff that has time to write a grant. If he says, yes, there's somebody on staff that has time to write a grant, at that point, the artist will come in and she'll detail what she has in mind, and at that point, we'll say no or we'll say yes. And at that point then, if we say yes, then they'll go ahead and write the grant. If he comes back and says there's nobody available to write a grant, then we just don't do anything with it at
This is a
point.
single artist
Yes.
project?
Yes.
If he does have somebody to write the grant,
Yep.
are you going to take an input from other people and from maybe the school system and what have you for
Oh,
ideas?
yeah, definitely, definitely.
mean,
It could be many proposals coming to us, and then we would select the one that we wanted to use. We can only submit one for the Bloomberg grant, but we have one idea out there. Certainly, if there were other people that wanted to submit an idea, that would be fine too.
Can you tell us what that idea is, or you want to?
that's what she's keeping a secret.
You know, Groton is noted for three major things. You know, the first war, 1639, the war up there in Groton Heights, and the submarine, the atomic submarine. I mean, those three things are Groton.
Right. It wouldn't be tied to any one particular event. It would be more of a platform for ongoing art. So every year you could have a different public art project at this place or at these places. So it would be something that would not be tied to one thing. So to keep it fresh, then you'd have the infrastructure in place, and then you could use it for various things every year or every season if you wanted to. So it has a lot of versatility.
Yeah, I was going to suggest to you that we already have in Groton, we have the Mystic Art Center, and we have, and on the Thames River, there's a vacant building that would be ideal to make an art center, and that's the old bootlegger restaurant that's near Costa's Lobster Pound, or whatever. Either one of those, you know, we could enhance the place in Mystic, or we could develop a new place in Groton to be a venue for displaying art, a museum or whatever you would like, for displaying art from local artists or for bringing in art. And we could call it the Hygienic East.
Councilor Atwater.
Being members of CCM, don't they have people on their staff that could help us write a grant?
I don't have an answer to that question. So this is part of the whole process that we have to kind of think about. I think one of the things that I wanted to do was get a consensus. I think none of us want to spend tax dollars this year to do art, right? I love art, but I don't think it's in the budget this year. So then we have to decide if we want to try to pursue this other avenue to get something done. So that's why I wanted to talk about this tonight.
How many grant writers do we have?
We have none.
We have lots of people that do grants, but I don't know if we have a dedicated.
Yeah, we did. We hired somebody. We hired somebody a couple of years ago to be a dedicated grant writer.
Yeah.
Are they still here?
Yes, they are.
Who is it?
Perhaps.
John's saying they're not here anymore.
Who is it?
The position was budgeted, it was never filled.
Budgeted, never.
Budgeted, never filled.
And then dropped, the funding dropped. Yeah, the funding was cut.
If you would accept it, I would make a motion that we go ahead and find someone to write the grant and try to try to get the Bloomberg grant.
So
Someone
Wait,
will word that better?
No.
So all we want to do tonight is to find out if there's anybody on staff that is available to do this at this busy time of year. Is that okay? Okay. So is there consensus for the manager to find out if there's anybody on staff available to write a grant this time of year?
Well, the motion I made was to go ahead and do it, and it was seconded.
You can't write the
But
motion.
we, okay.
I mean, write the
wait,
grant.
Wait. Hold up. So, thank you, Councilor Aubry. The intent was not to forge ahead with this because there are so many unanswered questions. The intent was to direct the manager to find out what we have available and how we can proceed before we make any rash decisions. One of our things is we don't want to make decisions without fully exploring options.
Whose intent was that?
That was my intent, and it was
Okay.
my idea to
Right now,
add
there's
this
a motion
on.
on the floor before the council.
What was your
and
motion,
seconded.
please? Could you say it out loud?
I move that we move ahead with writing the grant and seeking the Bloomberg grant and trying to go ahead with the project.
So that was moved by Zepari, seconded by Moravsik. I would have to vote against that because we are nowhere near being ready to move ahead with writing a grant. We haven't even had discussion, as Councilor Atwater said, as to what the project is. So I would be opposed to that motion. And I hope the rest of you would have consensus with that because we're jumping in before we are ready. Councilor Atwater.
Well, I would agree with you that you're saying you want to find out if there's someone who can write the grant because we don't want to spend the money, and now the motion is saying we're going to spend the money to write the grant, and so that seems to be contradictory to what we're talking about. So I would vote no on the motion also.
I wasn't aware that we had to spend money to write a grant.
If you are taking staff time away from what their job needs to be at this time of year, which is taking care of the budget, if there is no one that has that time available, then it's going to cost you money.
I think the issue is, I haven't seen this grant
Right.
application. It could be a one-page grant, it could be a 50-page grant. We might not have the staff time to do a 50-page grant. I have to it was just brought up to you right a few minutes ago.
Right.
So I haven't seen anything on it yet.
Councilor Franco.
Before you write the grant, you need to know what the artwork is, you said, right?
Right, exactly. So there's a lot of other things that need to be done before we can actually move ahead with that. So if there's no other discussion on Councilor Zepari's motion, we'll vote on that motion to move ahead and write the grant. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
1, Zepari. All those opposed?
Aye.
Aye.
So 1 to 8, any abstentions? So the vote on that is 1 in favor, 8 opposed, 0 abstaining, so that motion fails. So then I'm just going to ask for consensus to ask the manager to move ahead to see what he can find out about staff availability. Is there any objection?
Well, the only thing I would add is that, as I say, I think that CCM
Okay.
could also help. So rather than limiting it to staff, just see if there's someone available to write the grant. Maybe there's somebody at the library that can do it. Maybe there's a school project that can do it. I don't know, but I'm just saying,
Great.
let's not limit it to just town staff.
Excellent.
And I think
Counselor Schmidt?
Connecticut College has a grant writing
Good.
program, and they might be willing to help us somehow.
Very good.
Right.
Okay. So the consensus to direct the manager, yes?
Yes.
Also,
We
okay,
grant
great.
the consensus, yes.
Thank you. So that is done. So we have another motion to suspend the rules for something that's come up. So Councilor Aubry, please.
Sure you don't want to do this? Motion to suspend.
Give him the mic, please. Thank you.
Da-da. Motion to suspend the rules. I hereby move pursuant to Town Council Rules, Section 7B, to suspend the council rules and allow the council to consider an executive session to discuss the sale plans for town-owned properties. So moved.
So moved by Aubry and seconded by Parker.
And directed by.
Okay, moved by Aubry, seconded by Parker to suspend the rules to consider an executive session to discuss the sale plans for town-owned property. All those in favor of suspending the rules to go into executive session to discuss town-owned property, say aye. Aye. Opposed, abstaining, that passed unanimously. So now, do you want Councilor Atwater to read this one?
Sure.
So we need that.
We're in executive session?
Not yet, not until we do this.
Motion for executive session. I hereby move that the members of the Town Council Committee of a Whole, Town Manager John Burr, and Planning and Development Services Director John Reiner go into executive session pursuant to General Statute Section 1-200, parens 6, parens D, for the purpose of discussing the lease, sale, or purchase of real estate concerning the town-owned properties.
So moved. Second.
Moved by Atwater and seconded by Parker. Okay, so now we have to vote on whether we want to go into executive session. So all those in favor of going into executive session, say aye. Aye. Opposed, abstaining? So moved unanimously. So we are in executive session.